How do you convince more than 900 people to die and make them believe it was the right thing to do? That is the question at the heart of one of the darkest and most disturbing stories in American history. Because Jim Jones didn't begin as a monster in the eyes of the people who followed him. He didn't look like death, he looked like hope. To many, he was a preacher, a protector, a man who seemed to care about the poor, the lonely, and the forgotten. He spoke about equality when America was deeply divided. He welcomed black and white families into the same church when much of the country still lived under the shadow of racism. He promised healing, justice, and a better world. And that is exactly what made him so dangerous. Because by the time people realized who he really was, many of them were already too deep inside his world to escape. Jim Jones began building that world in the 1950s when he founded a church movement that would eventually become known as the People's Temple. At first, it didn't look like the beginning of a cult. In fact, to outsiders, it often looked admirable. Jones presented himself as a progressive religious leader who genuinely cared about social justice. He fed the poor, helped struggling families, and preached a message of racial equality that felt radical and inspiring for its time. For many people, especially the vulnerable, the isolated, and those searching for purpose, he offered something they had been missing for a long time: belonging. And once people found that sense of belonging, they stayed. Not because they were stupid, not because they were weak, but because they believed they had finally found someone who truly saw them. That is what makes stories like this so unsettling. People often imagine cult followers as gullible or irrational, but the truth is far more uncomfortable. Most of the people who followed Jim Jones were not looking for death. They were looking for meaning, community, and safety. And Jones understood exactly how to exploit that. He didn't take control all at once. He built it slowly. First, he made people feel loved, then he made them feel needed, and eventually he made them feel dependent. That dependence became the foundation of his power. As his following grew, so did his control. Jim Jones was never satisfied with simply being admired. He needed obedience. He needed loyalty. He needed people to believe that their survival, emotionally, spiritually, even physically, depended on him. So he began breaking down the boundaries between faith and control. Followers were pushed to confess their secrets, reveal their weaknesses, and surrender more and more of their private lives to the temple. He humiliated people publicly, monitored relationships, manipulated guilt, and slowly inserted himself into every part of their identity. Over time, he wasn't just their pastor anymore. He was becoming the center of their reality. And then came one of the oldest tricks in the cult playbook: isolate the group from the outside world. Jones convinced his followers that the world beyond the temple was dangerous, corrupt, and hostile. The government couldn't be trusted. The media was lying. Critics were enemies. Family members who questioned him were portrayed as threats. He created an us versus them mentality so strong that leaving the group no longer felt like freedom. It felt like betrayal. And once a person starts believing that the only safe place in the world is inside the control of one man, escape becomes psychologically harder than captivity. By the 1960s and 70s, Jim Jones had moved much of his operation to California, first to Ukiah and later to San Francisco and Los Angeles, where his influence grew dramatically. This was a time of political unrest in America. There was distrust in institutions, racial tension, war, protest movements, and a growing hunger for leaders who seemed to offer moral clarity. Jones knew how to position himself inside that chaos. He presented the People's Temple as more than a church. It was a movement, a place where the poor were fed, the elderly were cared for, and racial unity was not just preached, but visibly practiced. To many people, especially in progressive circles, Jim Jones looked like a force for good. And that public image gave him something even more powerful than followers. It gave him credibility. He built connections with local politicians, gained public respect, and created a protective shield around himself. To the outside world, he often looked like a humanitarian, but inside the temple, a darker reality was taking shape. Former members began to speak about abuse, intimidation, punishment, financial exploitation, and total psychological domination. People were allegedly beaten, shamed, and pressured into surrendering their money, homes, and independence. The temple was no longer simply a religious movement. It was becoming a machine of control. As pressure and scrutiny began to build, Jones made a decision that would change everything. If the outside world was becoming too dangerous, then he would create a new world entirely. A place far away from the media, the critics, the government, and anyone who might challenge his authority. He found that place in Guyana, a small English-speaking country in South America. Deep in the jungle, the People's Temple began building what Jim Jones described as a utopia, a socialist paradise, a safe haven, a place where his followers could finally live in peace, away from the corruption of America. He called it Jonestown. To his followers, Jonestown was sold as a dream, a fresh start, a place without racism, without capitalism, without persecution. But what was presented as a sanctuary quickly became something far more sinister, because isolation is one of the most powerful weapons a manipulator can use. And Jonestown was isolated in every possible way, geographically, socially, psychologically. Once followers arrived there, they were cut off from almost everything that had once anchored them to reality. Life in Jonestown was nothing like the paradise they had been promised. The settlement was harsh, exhausting, and deeply controlled. People worked long hours in the tropical heat, often with limited food and little privacy. Letters were monitored, movement was restricted, sleep was interrupted, and over loudspeakers, day and night, the voice of Jim Jones echoed constantly through the camp. His words were inescapable. His presence was everywhere. It wasn't just a commune anymore, it was an enclosed psychological world where one man controlled the truth. And by this point, Jim Jones himself was unraveling. He was heavily paranoid, increasingly unstable, and reportedly abusing drugs while becoming more obsessed with enemies, betrayal, and violent collapse. He told his followers that the United States government was coming for them, that fascists would destroy them, that the CIA, the media, and hostile forces were circling around them. Whether he believed all of it or not almost doesn't matter. What matters is that his followers did, or at least enough of them did. And fear, once fully installed, can become more powerful than reason. This is also where one of the most horrifying elements of the story begins, the rehearsals. Jones started conducting what became known as White Nights, late-night emergency drills, in which followers were gathered and told they were under threat. Sometimes they were told enemies were approaching, other times they were told the end had come. And during some of these drills, they were handed drinks and told they might be poisoned. Afterward, Jones would reveal that it had only been a test, a loyalty test, a rehearsal, a way of measuring who would obey and who would hesitate. Think about what that does to a human mind. If you repeatedly simulate death, fear, and obedience in a closed environment, eventually, the unthinkable begins to feel familiar. This wasn't random madness. It was conditioning. Jim Jones was slowly preparing people for a moment when the idea of dying under his command would no longer feel impossible. Meanwhile, outside Jonestown, concern was growing rapidly. Families of temple members and former followers had begun sounding the alarm. They claimed that people were being held against their will, abused, and prevented from leaving. Those concerns eventually reached Congressman Leo Ryan, a US representative who decided to travel to Guyana and investigate the situation for himself. He didn't go alone. Journalists, camera crews, and concerned relatives went with him, hoping to see whether Jonestown was really the peaceful commune Jim Jones claimed it was. At first, Jones tried to control the visit just like he controlled everything else. The visitors were shown a carefully staged image of community life, smiling residents, music, routine, calm. On the surface, everything looked orderly, but that illusion didn't last. Behind the scenes, several members of Jonestown secretly passed notes to Ryan's team, pleading for help. Some wanted out, some were terrified, Some simply wanted someone on the outside to know the truth. And the moment those messages appeared, the entire performance began to collapse. For Jim Jones, this was the beginning of the end. When Leo Ryan and his group prepared to leave Jonestown, several defectors decided to leave with them. That decision shattered the image of total loyalty Jones had built so carefully over the years. And he reacted the way many absolute rulers do when they begin to lose control, with violence. As Ryan's group headed to the Port Kaituma airstrip, armed temple members attacked. The gunfire killed Congressman Leo Ryan, along with several journalists and others who had come to investigate. More people were wounded. It was a shocking act of political violence, and the moment Jim Jones crossed a line from which there would be no return, because after that, he knew authorities would come. He knew the outside world would finally break through the walls he had spent years constructing. And rather than surrender his control, he chose something even more horrifying. If his world was going to collapse, then everyone inside it would collapse with him. Back in Jonestown, after the airstrip attack, Jim Jones gathered his followers for what would become one of the deadliest mass death events in modern history. He told them that the world was closing in, that soldiers would come, that their children would be tortured, that there was no future left for them. And then he reframed death itself, not as defeat, but as resistance. He called it revolutionary suicide. That phrase matters, because it shows exactly how far his manipulation had gone. He was no longer just controlling how people lived. He was controlling how they understood death. He took the most final, terrifying act imaginable and repackaged it as dignity, loyalty, and political meaning. That is the final form of total psychological domination, when a leader can convince people that dying for him is a moral choice. Then came the poison. A fruit drink was mixed with cyanide and other substances. Children were poisoned first. And that is one of the most unbearable truths in the entire story. The children did not choose anything. They did not understand ideology, revolution, or loyalty. They trusted the adults around them. They trusted the people who were supposed to protect them. Many were given the poison through syringes or cups. After the children, adults followed. And this is where an important correction has to be made. For years, popular culture reduced Jonestown to a disturbing phrase, drinking the Kool-Aid. But that phrase hides the brutality of what really happened. This was not a simple case of hundreds of people calmly choosing death in some unified spiritual ritual. The reality was far more chaotic, coercive, and horrifying. Many people were terrified. Some may have believed Jones until the end. Others likely did not. Armed guards were reportedly present. Escape was nearly impossible. Psychological resistance had been worn down over years. And the children, of course, had no agency at all. That is why many historians and researchers argue that what happened at Jonestown was not just a mass suicide, it was also mass murder. On November 18, 1978, more than 900 people died in Jonestown, including hundreds of children. Jim Jones himself was found dead from a gunshot wound. When authorities arrived, they found bodies covering the ground in one of the most horrifying scenes in American history. A man who had once promised justice, safety, and belonging had led his followers into total annihilation. And maybe the most disturbing part of all is this: Jim Jones didn't control people by appearing evil. He controlled them by appearing necessary. He offered people exactly what they were missing: community, certainty, protection, meaning. And then slowly turned all of it into a weapon. That is why Jonestown still matters. Not because it was bizarre, not because it was too crazy to happen again, but because it reveals something deeply uncomfortable about how power works when it wears the mask of compassion. Jim Jones didn't just build a cult, he built an emotional prison and convinced people it was home. And that is what makes Jonestown more than just a tragedy. It is a warning, because sometimes the most dangerous people in history are not the ones who look terrifying from the beginning. Sometimes they look like the answer. Subscribe to Nexora for more real stories.
You're not able to see me clearly. things just blur to you. You have to stumble around lately through crowds and are not able to see even people's faces close up to you clearly.